What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for The Flash Season 5, Episode 13, titled Goldfaced, which in my opinion was easily the worst episode of this season so far, and I will go over why that is. The episode continued where the last episode left off with where Barry wants to cure Cicada with the cure that Cisco and Caitlin are currently making, which that in of itself doesn't make any sense because just the episode before that, or whatever episode it was, I think it was the episode before that, Barry and Killer Frost defeated Cicada by themselves. I mean, Killer Frost is immune to Cicada's dampening abilities, and she could just stall Cicada while Barry defeats him like they did in that episode, so it's weird why Barry is just so desperate to cure Cicada when Cicada is not really much of a threat anymore, especially after this episode where we see later Iris defeats Cicada by herself. That I will talk about. That's ridiculous and stupid, and it's something I hated in this episode. Cicada doesn't feel threatening or menacing at this point because Barry and Caitlin defeated them, or him, by themselves, and Barry could have killed him, but he didn't, which was a moment in that episode that definitely was not a good moment where they just let Cicada escape. So now that Barry's so desperate to cure Cicada because he sees Cicada as this huge threat, it doesn't make any sense. And this episode, with the whole storyline with Barry and Ralph going undercover, it doesn't really further that plot. In fact, by the end of this storyline, it turns out it didn't really matter at all, and now they're just abandoning that whole thing where they want to cure Cicada, instead using whatever Iris did in this episode. That's something I didn't like this episode, and then this storyline is a huge part of why I didn't like this episode. It doesn't really mean anything, and in the end, it means even less than I expected it to mean. Which doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad episode. Just because it's a filler episode doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, my favorite episode ever on the show, episode 15 of Season 4, Enter Flash Time, is technically a filler episode, so just because it's filler doesn't mean it's bad. And I think that if we're going to do a filler episode, it might as well be in the middle of the season, like episode 13. I mean, at the end or the beginning of the season doesn't really work. Episode 13 definitely does, but if you're going to do a filler episode, make it different and make it interesting. I don't think this episode did that. It made the whole storyline was Barry and Ralph going undercover, being depowered, which is a thing they have been doing this entire season. Not going undercover, but being depowered. Whenever they fight Cicada, they are depowered. At least Barry, Ralph, and Vibe are, or Flash, Elongated Man, and Vibe are. So this isn't exactly a new thing in the season, and honestly, at this point, I don't like that they're being depowered when they're fighting Cicada either. Initially, I did at the beginning of the season because it was interesting, it was different. Now, I just want to see the Flash and Elongated Man use their powers for the most part, so being depowered is kind of lame, especially in a situation like this, where it's completely different from the main reason they're getting depowered every time, and now there's another reason. I don't like that in particular. I do like Barry and Ralph's whole dynamic in whenever they hang out in like episodes like this. I do like that. I do think that they work well together in these episodes. They did a lot of episodes like that in Season 4, which I did like. It was one of the best parts of Season 4, in my opinion. They haven't really been doing it much this season, so I'm glad that they did that in this episode. But I don't think that whole dynamic was enough to save this storyline from being pretty lame and pretty boring. Goldface himself, I do think, is not a bad villain. I do think they should have done more with his abilities. Like at the end, we find out that he's actually made of gold. That's very interesting. They could have done something with that, like a little bit more than they did. They did like a little bit where he was shot, and that didn't really hurt him that much. And then he was electrocuted by that thing, which it took him out and kind of melted his gold. Somehow didn't kill him. I don't know how, but I do think they should have done a little bit more with the fact that he's golden. Like I do know this would have been probably expensive, but it would have been cool to see all of his skin melt off and just become a completely golden man that they have to fight. That would have been really, really cool. They just didn't do much of that. I think the Goldface himself, outside of the golden thing, was definitely not a bad villain. Definitely a pretty good one-off villain. One of the better villains of the week if he's never going to come back, which he probably won't. But still, they could have done a lot more with that character. But this storyline in general, the Barry and Ralph dynamic was good, but the rest of it was kind of filler, not really much to it. The depowering of these characters is kind of lame at this point, and the villain himself, while good, they could have done a lot more with that villain. So this is a storyline that I didn't really like. And yet, that storyline was actually the best part of the episode because at least it was a little bit fun. The other two storylines in this episode were not good at all. The one of them, it was Iris getting back to blogging / being an investigative reporter, which I do like. She's back to doing that because I do think that she should have been doing that this entire time, like all 5 of these seasons, being an investigative reporter. Maybe they should have just more gradually built up her starting a newspaper instead of doing it in just one episode. I don't think she should have ever joined Team Flash, and definitely not be the leader of Team Flash, just really be an investigative reporter and love interest to Barry, and in season 5, a mother kind of to Nora. So I'm glad that she's back to doing this, but this storyline is pretty terrible. She finds out where Cicada lives, and instead of telling the rest of Team Flash that she knows where Cicada lives, she goes there by herself, which that alone was completely and utterly ridiculous. It was so stupid that they did. It doesn't make any sense. Why would she go by herself to the house of the main villain? And then when she gets there, she has this whole talk with Cicada, which was probably the best part of this storyline. It was a little bit spooky, a little bit scary. The main love interest and one of the characters of this show is in the house and presence of the main villain. Definitely not as spooky as it should have been, where the main villain, who has been teased as a pretty scary guy, is right there. I never felt like she was in danger, which is pretty stupid and pretty ridiculous, but it was still a little bit spooky. That's definitely true. But the worst part of this storyline was definitely the fight between Cicada and Iris. I mean, this whole fight was so stupid. It basically made Cicada the least menacing villain on this show ever, in my opinion. I mean, just a couple episodes ago, he was defeated, like 100% defeated by Killer Frost and the Flash, making him way less menacing than he's been brought up to be. But now he's basically completely defeated by Iris West. Iris, who has no powers or ability or any know-how about fighting, is able to basically get the upper hand on the main villain of this season, who has all of his powers and his main weapon as well, with pepper spray, as well as later a kitchen knife, which in my opinion is probably one of the stupidest scenes they've ever shown on this show. This is not one of the main superheroes of Team Flash. It's not even a character who knows anything about fighting. It's the main love interest of the show, and this is a villain that's supposed to be super menacing, and the last couple episodes he has become basically an afterthought. He's become a character who I feel like Team Flash can pretty easily defeat. I mean, Flash himself can just run up to him, stick a knife in him without Cicada really ever noticing, and that will cause him immeasurable pain, like we saw in this episode. I, at this point, hate Cicada as a villain. I do think that he is a terrible villain of this season, even worse than the Thinker, just because of this one scene where Iris is able to get the upper hand with pepper spray and a kitchen knife, as well as escape. Cicada is not menacing anymore. He's not scary anymore, and that's one thing I hate about this episode in particular. It made Cicada a worse villain, even more so than that other episode where Flash and Killer Frost defeated Cicada by themselves. This episode took it to a whole nother level where Iris was able to defeat Cicada by herself. This was ridiculous. The last storyline has to do with Nora trying to distract Sherlock. I'm gonna call him Sherlock because Sherlock is a pretty annoying thing to say. Like every time I'm gonna call him that. But the whole storyline was Nora trying to distract Sherlock from finding out who she's working with by bringing up all of his past wives and giving him a new love interest in the form of the Earth 1 version of all of his wives. And I didn't like this storyline. I do like Sherlock in general. I think he's one of the better versions of Harrison Wells, and I do like the whole storyline where he's investigating Nora and finding out who she's working with. But I didn't like this episode. It completely deviated from that plot to a plot that didn't really matter at all. Nora's obviously trying to distract Sherlock, but this is not a solution in the long run. This is just a temporary solution just to really push off Sherlock from investigating this. I mean, this is not going to work the entire time. It doesn't really make any sense that Eobard Thawne thinks this will work the entire time. I don't know if he does. Maybe he just thinks they need to distract Sherlock just a little bit more, not just for this week or the entirety of this season or the entirety of their lives, really, until Nora goes back to 2049. But this solution is pretty stupid, and the way they executed in this episode is also pretty stupid. This whole storyline felt very season 4 with all the councils of the Wells, council of Harrisons. I didn't like those things in season 4. In fact, I practically hated them. It was pretty stupid, and this episode was even worse with a character that we've never met before, and then they're going to bring all these alternate versions of those characters. So this is another storyline I really didn't like. It was stupid. It didn't really matter whatsoever. It didn't make any sense, and it really deviated from the pretty interesting plot of Sherlock investigating Nora. In conclusion, Goldfaced, in my opinion, is one of the worst episodes in a very, very long time on this show. The show hasn't really sunk this low in a very long time, and it doesn't really feel good that it's doing it. All 3 storylines in this episode were not good. Ralph and Barry was at least a little bit fun, and Goldface himself was not a bad villain, but also I didn't like it how they were all depowered in general, and how it didn't really matter in the end. The Iris investigating Cicada was a terrible storyline. Excess trying to distract Sherlock from finding out who she's working with was a pretty bad storyline, and the episode in general was mostly filler with a couple bad storylines, so I will give episode 13 of season 5 a 6.2 out of 10, one of the worst episodes of the show in a very, very long time. But what do you think about this episode? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you just think it's in between? Do you think it's mediocre, which is, in my opinion, what it is? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.